Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Heritage Foundation think tank in Washington, D.C., where we're talking to Bruce Klingner, who is one of the nation's top North Korean analysts, somebody who has an extreme amount of job security given recent events. And welcome back from your, I got to ask you about your really cool shark adventure in Australia, because that's something that not a lot of people do, is sort of swim with the great whites. Normally swimming in sharks is the Washington political environment, not actually the real thing. But the more important thing is what happened. The North Korean launch yesterday over Japanese territory. The North Koreans have made such launches in the past, but there has always been warning. Talk to us a little bit about why this launch was really different and why it has everybody on edge.
Well, I think it's different both technically as well as politically. Technically, they had been testing the Hwasong-12 intermediate-range ballistic missile. It's had successful tests in the past. We're still a little unclear whether this one broke into three pieces, as some reports have, but they have been testing it. They needed to test it more to a full range as opposed to the high trajectory that they had been doing it so that it didn't fly over Japan. So technically, they needed to do this kind of test. But by going over Japan, it had a very provocative, really brazen component to it. So it's the first time North Korea has flown over Japan with a missile since 2009. So it's seen as more risky, more dangerous. If the missile had failed, it could have landed in Japan, perhaps even led to some casualties. So, and it's also being seen as a bit of an in-your-face response to perhaps the U.S. comments, pressure on North Korea.
You mentioned that it could have been the comments from the United States that could have precipitated this. What are some other reasons that could be driving this, and what's the right way to get through to North Korea? Because after the last test, there was a sense that the international community was coming together. China was going to get much, much tougher on North Korea than it's been in the past. What are some other reasons why North Korea would have done this? And what's the next step for the international community? And we're saying this before the Security Council has even met.
Right. Really, we don't know why or when North Korea does these tests. We, in a way, I think we get a bit too wrapped around the axle as to why did they do it? Was it a response? Why did they do it on a certain day? Was it a holiday? Really, we need to focus on the fact that they did it. So for technical reasons, they needed to continue testing the system. It's not yet been deployed, although North Korean officials told me in Europe in June that both the Hwasong-12 and the Musudan intermediate-range missiles would be deployed to military units soon. So from a technical requirement, there was a need to do this. But also, we always perceive political signals. Was it a response to the ongoing U.S.-South Korean military exercises, the U.S.-Japan ballistic missile defense tests that were occurring the same day? Was it a response to U.S. comments by President Trump of, threatening fire and fury if North Korea were to continue threatening the U.S.? So, in a way, we don't know. But, I think sometimes by coming up with reasons, it's a way of trying to downplay the North Korean violation. If they see it as a response to our exercises, people may blame the exercises, which are valid and allowed, as opposed to the missile launch, which is a violation of UN resolutions.
And then there was the comment the president made at the rally that it was in response to that North Korea dropped back, and you can just imagine Kim Jong-un saying to himself, well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to be undeterred. This is a little bit of a slap to Beijing. Beijing had put a lot of pressure, changed its position to a degree. But, for example, North Korean workers can still go around the world, which is a very important source of revenue for the regime. And, the Security Council was not as tough on North Korea as they could have been. What do you think some of the next steps are to really start to squeeze even harder on North Korea?
Well, really, the UN is never as tough as it could be. The U.S. and its allies always ask for more than China is willing to allow. China always allows an incremental improvement in UN resolutions. Each resolution is better than the preceding one. Each one is the toughest in history until the next one. So, and also Beijing has a history of not fully implementing required UN Security Council resolution sanctions. So, they often talk a good game, but then underdeliver in reality. So, but they did allow first a cap and then now a ban on export of some key resources for North Korea, big cash products for them, such as coal. Another step could be capping or banning export of oil to North Korea. So that would be a significant step, but we don't know if Beijing would allow it.
There are those who argue, though, that if you get tougher with the regime but don't leave an out, you're actually making things worse, right? The guy thinks he's a dead ender, and then he may have to take steps. Although I think the notion that the leadership is homicidal but not suicidal is actually accurate. Do you think that there's any one thing? I mean, you and all of your Track 2 meetings and other things that you've had where you've had interactions with the North Korean side, are there things that are going to deter them at all?
I think we need to distinguish between diplomacy and law enforcement. So on the diplomacy side, we can continue to implore, cajole, pressure Beijing to do more, to allow better sanctions, as well as to fully implement those sanctions. On the law enforcement side, the U.S. has been pulling its punches. We know, because the vast majority of all international financial transactions are denominated in dollars and therefore must go through U.S. banks, that we could have been taking action against more North Korean entities and certainly Chinese facilitators of prohibited North Korean activity. We've imposed $12 billion in fines on European banks for money laundering for Iran. We haven't imposed a single dollar in fines on Chinese banks. The Trump administration recently sanctioned one Chinese bank. That's the first in 12 years. There are many more Chinese banks that are involved in these prohibited activities. So the U.S., regardless of what the Chinese government wants, we could be enforcing our laws. We could be influencing Chinese banks and businesses away from engaging with North Korea.
And what kind of impact is this going to have on Japan? Defense spending is up. There's a 2% increase that's happening. Prime Minister Abe himself tweeted there was an 8-minute warning window where Japanese, over the course of the track going over Japan, were urged to take shelter if they could. There were some Japanese that are were concerned about that. A friend of mine is in the finance business, and his Tokyo office had called him, in a bit of a panic in the immediate aftermath of that. But there are also some in Japan who are concerned about how the United States is going to respond and whether or not they're going to end up being pulled into a regional confrontation. What's your sense from your Japanese friends on how this is going to change Japan's psyche, the U.S.-Japan alliance, and how both of the countries move ahead, whether it's defensively, offensively, or in other ways?
Well, when North Korea overflew Japan with missiles in 1998 and 2009, it really it created a sense of vulnerability for Japan, and it led to first decisions for additional missile defense systems and then subsequently to accelerate programs. So Japan already has a fairly robust missile defense system. They have the SM-3 based on ships, they have Patriots, and they recently made a decision to deploy Aegis ashore, sort of a mid-level defense. So what this launch may do is accelerate that deployment, may lead to deploying additional systems or more launchers as each of these existing systems. It may lead to greater discussion in Japan for counter-strike or counter-offensive capabilities, but that sort of goes against the basic feeling of the larger populace, and certainly always would raise tensions with South Korea as well as China.
The president, did get some criticism for using fire and fury regarding the U.S. response to North Korea after the last test. There are folks who've commented on it. You and I haven't had a chance to talk since then. I mean, was that an appropriate thing to say? I mean, there are those who say that the president is absolutely right. I mean, should North Korea ever use nuclear weapons against the United States, it would bear the brunt of a nuclear retaliation. I think folks have said that over time. Every president has sort of reiterated that since Bill Clinton. But talk to us a little bit about that comment and why it had so many people on such edge, if you will.
Well, it was not just the wording, but it was really the context. So rather than talking about a U.S. response to a North Korean attack on ourselves or our allies. It was really suggesting a preventative attack, not even a preemption attack where if we feel North Korea is about to attack us, but simply a military attack to prevent them from completing an ICBM capability, sort of a start a war to prevent a war. So I think that was the concern. And also H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor, had said that the president had told him that North Korea simply having the capability to hit the United States with a nuclear warhead is intolerable, and he had directed the military to at least come up with the option for a preventative attack. So I think that was the concern. Also, when he said fire and fury like the world has never seen, and he said that on the anniversary of the Nagasaki bombing, which raised the question of was he talking about a nuclear preventative attack. Subsequently to that, we had all the senior U.S. leadership, Mattis and Tillerson and Pompeo and others, in a way walking back the president's comment. Their comments, while very firm and resolute, were more in the context of if North Korea does attack, the U.S. will respond with all necessary force. So while some would say the president's comments would seek to intimidate North Korea or even induce China to put more pressure on North Korea, it also raises concerns amongst our allies. I've talked to a number of Asian allies who were concerned that it could entangle them in a conflict that they would see as needlessly provocative or needlessly premature. So it can have a number of messages, and the messages received may not be the messages that were sent.
Do we have any sense whether the North Koreans, whether Kim Jong-un is moved by such rhetoric?
Again, it's always a guessing game or a best assessment when dealing with North Korea. But had the comments been directed more personally at Kim Jong-un, then North Korea responds very strongly to those. Remember when there was the movie The Interview, and it led North Korea to conduct a massive cyber attack on Sony Pictures and also threaten 9/11 style attacks on any U.S. theater or theater goer.
And one of the things that in response to that Kim Jong-un said is that he would bracket Guam with North Korean missiles. I think, he did the same thing. I've asked my staff to draw up plans, 4 missiles, I think it was, to bracket on either side of the island. What would the implications of that be? And what does the U.S. response to that should be?
Well, initially they talked about a strike, and people interpreted that as an attack. And then they even talked about an enveloping strike, and I think it was more a demonstration. They said the missiles would land on either side, as you point out, of Guam outside of international waters. So we do have a THAAD missile defense system on Guam. Had any of the missiles been directed at Guam, we certainly should take it out. And even within the U.S. territorial waters around Guam, out to 12 nautical miles, I think we would be in our rights to intercept those missiles. Beyond that, then you get into a debate as to if it's not clearly a threat to U.S. citizens or U.S. territory, and it's just simply going to splash in the sea. Do you try to take it out, or is that the provocation? So, we don't know the administration thinking. Some saw North Korea not doing that, or Kim Jong-un saying he's put that decision on hold as walking back. I think it may simply be a delay.
So talk to us a little bit about the vacation. It was really extraordinary photographs that you ended up taking. So you were in Australia. Talk to us a little bit about that. You were in the water actually while it was being chummed for great whites. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was in Australia for a conference and some meetings with government officials, and figured I'd cross something off the bucket list and do a cage dive with great white sharks. So we saw some large great white sharks swimming by the boat, and we thought it'd be a good idea to get into the water, into a cage. I found actually it quite relaxing compared with working North Korea, particularly the last 2 months when things have been very busy and very stressful. So being in the cage, I was outside of North Korean missile range. I was outside of journalist email range. I couldn't be called on to do any interviews. So it was actually quite relaxing, even when the 12 or 15-foot great white shark slammed into our cage. We all turned to each other and gave each other a thumbs up. We thought this was fun. This was great.
And I mean, it is such an impressive animal. I mean, what's it like to be in such close proximity with one?
Well, much less stressful having a cage in between the two of us, though I think all of us were remembering videos on YouTube of, great white shark epic fail when we've seen some of these cages have broken or the shark has gotten into it. I made sure the windows of the cage were quite small. Some of the other ones have been large enough that a shark got into the cage. So, I mean, they really are amazing, majestic creatures. But when you see the teeth and the power that these creatures could have, and the speed with which they move, you are very glad to have a cage between you and them.
Bruce, thanks very much again. And thanks for sharing that personal story.
Thanks for having me.